So thank you for joining in a little bit early today. I sent you the link. I'm giving a talk at the University of Baltimore at 2 o'clock about the book that I wrote last year on privacy. So if you're interested, you should be able to access that if you want to come and hear me get reamed by their philosophy department. So we'll see how that goes. Need to put on my fighting gloves. I had fully intended to include a video, have a little video of Warhol today for you all to laugh at. But in the world of Zoom, things are so unpredictable, and my mother-in-law needed my computer to do her aerobics class. And so that happened all morning, and then I never got to find my Warhol video. So next week, I promise we'll open up with a humorous Warhol video. Or two, and there's also a nice interview. Actually, I think they're both interviews that are really interesting, because I think they're a nice complement to what Danto has to say here, and how he understands Warhol, how he, in one sense, what's funny about Warhol is that he doesn't want anybody to understand him. So, but I don't know. So I can't tell if Danto has done that or not. But the other thing I want to tell you is, so for next week, your reading is we're taking a turn into psychoanalysis and art. You're going to be reading Freud's essays, The Uncanny and Creative Writers and Daydreaming, and they're both on Canvas. Okay. After that, you are all on spring break party. And then the week after that, your midterm is due. So I believe I've already posted your midterms on Canvas, but I'll double check that. Next week, we'll go over those midterms, okay? I am recording this here, though, so this will be posted on Canvas, and if anybody needs to access it, at a later date. Today I had you guys read 3 more essays by Danto. The first essay deals with Clement Greenberg and the Kantian view of art and art criticism and his response to that. The second one has to do with the Platonic critique, Plato's critique of art, and how Warhol was a rebuttal of that. And then the third one has to do with the museum. And I was just reading over that essay on the museum before you all came in here and thinking that museum, that chapter on the museum is rather ambiguous, or I think he's ambiguous. There's some potentially explosive suggestions in that chapter, but in the end, I think I know where he stands on the value of the museum, but he does waffle a little bit, and not without reason. But in any case, so that'll be interesting for us to pull that apart. By the way, before I forget, I think I'm going to end around 1:45 because I'm going to have to need a few minutes to go get ready for my talk at UB, okay? So anybody have any general comments or questions about anything I've been babbling about here? The plan, the readings. He hates Brooklyn. Don't we all? Oh, we don't? Oh, no. I was just in a class yesterday talking about gentrification, and I was pooping on Brooklyn. I mean, I don't know. I like Brooklyn. I don't know. It's just.
It has its own problems, of course, but he kind of like says everyone in Brooklyn is an idiot, basically.
Well, it's just funny, when he's talking about when that museum was built, Brooklyn must have been, it is funny to think about the people who were building that museum, because Brooklyn was working class, Irish, Italian, Jewish, and African American at that point, right? I mean, it's not what it was today, right? Brooklyn was working class. So the idea that these patricians are building a giant museum is kind of out of touch.
Well, it's just so elitist to assume that
even that working class, area is not without its own, desire for culture, demand for culture, just this kind of like pining for Manhattan, um, is just such an elitist stance. Um, you know,
It would be really interesting to see, like, to learn more about the founding motivations behind that museum, at
because
that
now
point.
I mean, that museum now, in my perspective, is one of the most successful museums in New York City, as well. So I think it's kind of, um, it's interesting.
I've never been in it. I've walked by it. It sits on Prospect Park, right?
Yeah, and the like big Brooklyn Botanical Gardens that
Mhm.
I would say are heavily competitive against Manhattan's, and Prospect Park, which was competitive against Central Park. So it's like, um, rivalries. There's a grouping of like Brooklyn, Manhattan rivalries that are grouped together right there.
And it's interesting how that rivalry might have been different back then, because I think when it was built, that was before the Brooklyn Bridge was built, I think. Anybody know when the Brooklyn Bridge was built? Which suggests to me that Brooklyn probably, viewed itself as more as a separate city at that point than Manhattan, right? If you had to go across to Brooklyn in the ferry. Any case, we'll get there. I think that essay is really interesting, and I find contemporary criticisms and worries about the museum to be fascinating. Frankly, of course, I say that as someone outside. Who are our curatorial folk here? I see. Anybody else? No. Okay. I guess Babette will have a lot to say then. All right. Well, what I want to start off with is I want to hit on a couple of the main points from last week, kind of where we ended. We were looking at that essay where he was talking about the scope of art. I think he was talking about that quote from Belting about an era before art. And I think actually this is going to be interesting. This kind of looks ahead to the essay on museum that kind of ties it all together. But Belting makes this suggestion that there is an era before art, which which Danto seems to appreciate. And he characterizes the history of art in this manner. There was an era before art when art was not viewed as something appreciated on its own aesthetically, but as part of, an object of worship, tied into the act of worship. If not an art object, was an object of worship itself. And then after 1400, he says things change, and you start to get art proper, which means basically art as a secular object and an expression of beauty. Beauty throughout this period is conflated with representation and, I guess, imitation, because he calls this the age of mimesis, or the age of imitate. I think he calls it the age of imitation. And up through the mid 1800s, good art was art that depicted reality in realistic fashion, for lack of a better word, represented accurately, if you will. Imitation was the goal, to convey the beauty of nature or God's creation, right? So it satisfied both secular and religious goals at once. And then that changes with Manet, that changes with modernism. With modernism, art becomes more self-conscious, and you start to get these movements that make assertions that are kind of contentious with one another, right? This is art. Like we were reading from the quote from Mondrian last week, right? This is art, what I'm doing. All that other stuff y'all are doing is shit, but this is art. And then after another decade, someone comes along and says, no, this is art, right? And it's really kind of funny the way he describes this era, these very egotistical artists and their various art movements putting the stamp on art as such. And then that quote by who was that quote by? Was it Joseph Beuys? It was, the quote was, "I'm making art that will last 1,000 years." Right.
That was Rothko.
Oh yeah. And that's just so funny. You know, these movements didn't last long, but each one thought, okay, now finally this is art and this will last 1,000 years. And then 10 years later, whoops, sorry. And it's almost like the abstract expressionists were the most sanctimonious of them all. It's like it builds and builds and builds. It comes to an insufferable peak, where these successive groupings of artists, movements think, no, we're really it. And I love the way he describes the abstract expressionists in your reading for today as they're shamans. That, I don't know how you pronounce it, shamans. They're like in touch with a mystical, some kind of mystical truth. They're priests. They're a priest. Who are the abstract expressionists? Rothko, Barnett Newman. Who else? Isn't Pollock considered an abstract expressionist?
Pollock, I think de Kooning, but Jackson Pollock didn't take him seriously because he would draw figures. And
also
that's cool.
I think maybe Rauschenberg was like younger, but he kind of like was circling around them, but then kind of went his own way.
Gotcha. They were generally all white men with appetites. Isn't that another way of thinking of these guys? I once saw the movie about Pollock a few years ago. So, chauvinists, pretty awful chauvinists too. Right. But in any case, the point being, like, now these guys, now we have a line on what truth is and true art is and true expression. And this will last 1,000 years. And then by 63, it was done. This era, the era of modernism, he also calls the age of manifestos. So we go from the era before art, we have the age of imitation, and then we have the age of manifestos, and the manifesto being a declaration, right? So each of these art movements says they declare this is what art is, and this is, and everything else is not. And then along comes pop art, and Andy Warhol is the fatal breach that ushers in the era of contemporary art, which is radically different. Anything goes at this point. Beauty is no longer a consideration. There's no single definition of what art is. It seems, as Danto puts it, the self-consciousness of art proceeds a further step. The narrative being something like this. Prior to 1400, art did not know what art was. It didn't even know it was art. During the age of imitation, it is more self-conscious about what it's doing, and it even has its own unique goal, which is beauty. The age of manifestos, we see another step in self-consciousness of art, saying, like, this is art and all that is not. To the next level in self-consciousness, Warhol asks the question, what is art? Or is this art at all? Right? And this now is this is the fundamental, this is, if it can be called that, this is the unifying intellectual claim of, if each of the age of manifestos had its own intellectual unifying claim, the unifying claim of contemporary art is completely is quite wide open, and it's really just problem with each artwork saying, is this art, right? And what is art? Opening up even more. I'm going to pause there for a second. Anybody have any questions? So I mentioned this last week, but the major philosophical influence for Danto is Hegel. And Hegel would be very happy with the way I just described the history of art, because he understands all history as this is Hegelian speak, y'all, okay? History is the unfolding of spirit. And he usually capitalized it, spirit. Geist in German. There is another way to put it is that history is itself an unfolding development of consciousness. And where this development of consciousness takes place is in human beings. We are the principal instrument of self-consciousness in the universe. In the history of art, this means for Hegel that spirit is very implicit, or that meaning is very implicit. And then as art progresses, it becomes more and more explicit until it sheds art altogether. And like a butterfly coming out of a cocoon, it is philosophy. You can dislike it. I'm just telling you. I'm just delivering the message. So that's why Hegel ranks the forms of art. Architecture is the very bottom because meaning is implicit. Poetry is the highest because it is the most abstract. He favors abstraction. The progression in art is a process of abstraction. I think it's right. So, and poetry is already the most abstract art. It has the least material or medium, right? It's just voice at that point until it sheds matter altogether and becomes pure thought. I wanted to call your attention to one quote by Matisse here on page 44, because I think this will be helpful as we move into our discussion for today. The bottom of 44, Matisse says, the arts have a development which comes not only from the individual, but also from an accumulated strength, the civilization which precedes us. One cannot just do anything. A talented artist cannot do just as he likes. If he used only his talents, he would not exist. We are not the masters of what we produce. It is imposed on us. So Danto likes this quote because he thinks that it characterizes his view, which is Hegel's view, that the artist, like all of us, like all, for Hegel's view, all individual humans are just agents, unwitting agents in the progress of history. And an artist is also an unwitting agent or accomplice in the progress of history. Right? You give voice, an artist gives voice to something that's something historical that surges through you. You can't help it. And we have to understand the various ages of art in that way. The era before art, artists were acting in a way they couldn't help. Same with the age of imitation, same with manifestos. And then suddenly, what's happened with contemporary art on the historical stage is that it's a massive state of liberation, massive active liberation. The political analogy to the history I've been talking about for Hegel is that democracy sits at the apex of history as well. We progress towards democracy. And that's certainly the way he describes, especially when we start to talk about, Danto certainly senses very important democratic themes and emphases in Warhol. Warhol's art is more democratic. I think that's one way of putting it. All right. That's all I wanted to say about last week. Does anybody have any questions or comments about what I've been saying about the history of art from his view? All right. Good. Well, let's talk about your reading for today. I want to talk about Greenberg. Before I dive in, Greenberg is interesting because he is in the 20th century. He's the principal adherent or proponent of Kant's philosophy of art. Kant, I mentioned this to you before, that Kant and Hegel, in philosophy of art, the Germans have a monopoly. Okay, you can and should try to break through that. But Kant's philosophy of art, written in the 1700s, and then Hegel's in the early 1800s, are seen to be the two great traditions that really have dominated the conversation. And they're also seen to be at odds in pretty essential ways that cannot really be bridged. I think I mentioned to you last week, I had a professor in grad school who said, if you're Hegelian, you can't be a Kantian. And if you're Kantian, you just can't be Hegelian. And I didn't understand what all the hubbub was about. Seemed kind of silly to me. He was very passionate about it. And then I caught him dating an undergrad. I never viewed him the same. But anyway, that's another story. He was Hegelian. I just want to relate a couple points about Kant that I think are important. For Hegel, art is about the intellectual messaging. It's all about content. For Kant, it's all about form. The aesthetic experience is the experience of beauty for Kant. It's about beauty, and beauty is determined by form. It's also in the individual experience. The term that Kant uses is that he says that the aesthetic experience is singular, which means to say, the way he puts it is, the statement roses are beautiful. This is not an aesthetic statement. That is a logical statement. Because you're ascribing a characteristic to all roses. It's the same thing as saying all roses are red. Roses are beautiful, roses are red. An aesthetic statement, for him, the language is very important, hugely important. This rose is beautiful. That is an aesthetic statement. And it expresses singularity. This rose here, not all roses, this one that I am seeing right now, that I'm experiencing before me, at this moment, from this perspective, in this light, this is an aesthetic judgment. This is an aesthetic experience. The experience of beauty is, the judgment of beauty, is experiential. Okay. So you'll see that in your essay about Greenberg. It's all about experience. It is purportedly universal. This is one of the funniest things about Kant that he points out. You don't say, when you say an aesthetic judgment, this rose is beautiful, you don't say, this rose is beautiful for me. You don't say that. That's implied in a way, but the opposite is also implied, which is, this rose is beautiful, and if you can't see that, you're an idiot, right? So experiential and universal. Those are two aspects of of Kant's aesthetics that are really important, and the issue and the idea that form, that beauty hinges on form. I'm just curious, have you guys read Greenberg before? I know some people read them in the art history classes here.
I've read bits and pieces, but not enough to really know him that well.
Looks like Jennifer has read him. I guess he died. I didn't look up his dates. I think he died in the 80s or 90s, but my understanding is that he was incredibly influential for a very long time until pop art comes around, apparently. I'm going to hit on a couple quotes here, page 86. Middle of the page, bottom of that middle paragraph. This, which leads to another issue for another feature of Kant's aesthetics. Critical judgment, in Greenberg's view, operates in the abeyance of rule. Quality in art can be neither ascertained nor proved by logic or discourse. Experience alone rules in this area, and the experience, so to speak, of experience. This is what all the serious philosophers of art since Kant have concluded. The other point that Kant relates is that the experience of art is incommunicable. Not only the experience of art, but the production of art. The other great idea that Kant writes about is genius. I noticed your chapter here opens with a very beautiful quote from Schopenhauer on genius, and he shared this idea. Genius was a very important idea in German Romanticism in the 1700s and 1800s. And Kant's view is that artistic production is the result of genius. An artist is a genius. And before you get all pompous, he didn't mean it. They understood it slightly different from the way we do today. One notable feature I like to point out is that if you Google the word genius today, you'll come up with someone like Elon Musk or Bill Gates. We think of tech and business titans. That's not at all how the Romantic period saw it. They understood it. An artist is someone who has genius. And what is genius? It comes from the Latin ingenium. It was this idea that you have, in Latin, ingenium means you have an inborn spirit. It's like you're touched by God. But then what you can produce is something completely incommunicable and totally different. So the artistic production is incommunicable, and the appreciation of art is incommunicable. So if I see a beautiful rose out in the garden, I say, this rose is beautiful. And I call my wife up, who, now that we have cell phones, I can call from the garden and be like, yo, this rose is beautiful. And she's just not going to get it. Kant would say, bring her down out to the garden. She's got to see that, right? I could tell Kat, I saw a beautiful rose. Not good enough. Kat, you've got to come over here and see the rose for yourself in this light, in this perspective, in the same way I'm seeing it, okay? So the idea that it's incommunicable is also hugely important for Kant. I'm going to hit on a few more points, then open up for discussion. But next page, bottom of 87.
I was going to just say, I think it's funny about the reveal or needing to experience it. There's definitely something there, not just experiencing it, but how you're experiencing it. Because Greenberg had that kind of hilarious way of dramatically turning and being struck by it. And so I just wonder, that's not expanded on a lot, this idea of the tempo of which you're experiencing something.
I suspect Danto is not being entirely fair. That's my suspicion.
He's shocking.
There's something fishy going on here.
Right.
I was building up to the point that kind of sets up what you're talking about. It's related to a point I wanted to talk about in our review from last week. So I'll just make it now. Isn't it curious how art criticism falls apart in the age of contemporary art? He doesn't really give us anything for what an art critic does. It seems to suggest he thinks that an art critic can't or shouldn't really do anything anymore. And the way he piles on Greenberg here and beats him up in this essay seems to substantiate that. But let me make this point, and then I'll get hit on that again, Babette. The bottom of 87, he says, and Greenberg goes on to say that people who do not make the effort to experience or appreciate abstract art, they don't have the right to pronounce on any kind of art. They do not, because they have not taken the trouble to amass sufficient experience of it. I would just like to say off the bat, I'm not sure where that comes from, and that doesn't sound like Kant to me, but I'm going to move on. And it makes no difference in this respect how much experience they have in other fields of art. To be seriously interested in art, we might paraphrase Greenberg as saying, is to be seriously interested in the good in art. One is not for Chinese or Western representational art as a whole, but only for what is good in it. And Greenberg's second tenet entailed that the practiced eye can pick out the good from the bad in art of whatever sort, independently of any specific knowledge of the circumstances of production in the tradition to which the art belongs. The owner of the practiced eye is aesthetically everywhere at home. This is Greenberg's idea. Recently, a well-known curator boasted that without knowing anything about African art, he could, by means of his good eye alone, distinguish the good, the better, and the best. So this suggests that, like, there are standards of art appreciation, but good luck saying what they are, right? And I think that's his major problem with Greenberg. And then the other issue is, how do you, I'm a little bit annoyed with Greenberg's conception of experience here. I'm gonna do my best. I will always do my best to defend Kant. And I think, there's two different notions of experience here. I mentioned to you, Kant's point is that the aesthetic judgment is experiential. It's experience-based. It's based in an experience. The way that Greenberg is talking about it is almost slightly different. It's like experience. He understands experience as something over time. Like, I'm experienced, like, I have looked at a lot of art in my life. And that just seems like an alien notion to Kant. I don't think the main issue remains, the main problem remains for Danto. And that problem is, how do you know what good art is? You know it when you see it. And your criterion for judging it are incommunicable and inexplainable, and they're based on just a long track record. And this is where the socioeconomic critique, I guess, comes into play. Who has time? Here, we're talking about Brooklyn, right? In Brooklyn Museum. Who has time to become experienced in the way that Greenberg suggests, or as the Greenberg model suggests? Let me hit on one more quote here, and then we can open it up to this discussion of his funny way of viewing art. Regarding the universality of art, he has another point here on page 89. At the top, he says, quality in art is not just a matter of private experience. Greenberg writes, there is consensus of taste. The best taste is that of the people who in each generation spend the most time and trouble on art. And this best taste has always turned out to be unanimous within certain limits in its verdicts. If each individual cultivates an open mind and, to use a favorite expression of his, bears down hard enough, there will be no ultimate major disagreements. The idea of a mind not closed by theory and of trusting sustained visual experience alone is almost caricatured in his model of confronting a painting. There is a consensus of taste. If you don't see it yet, you haven't spent enough time. You need to bear down harder. And then we get his example of how he used to view it, how he would wheel abruptly around to let his practiced eye take it in without giving the mind a chance to interpose any prior theories, as if there were a race between the transmission of visual stimuli and the speed of thought. as if he wants to be judgment free. And yet his experience still will reliably help him determine whether he's seeing something beautiful or not. All right. So what do y'all think? What do y'all want to say about that?
There's, with both Greenberg and Danto, I just really, really struggle with the extremely like patriarchal white male narrowed narrative that is so determined in its statements. I don't know. It's hard to move past either Greenberg or Danto's kind of righteousness, I guess, is the tone. But in this like consensus of taste, like I think about, and it's mentioned in the writing, the ignorant schoolmaster, that writing, and just the like the knowing kind of what makes you an expert is knowing how much you don't know, or being comfortable with knowing how much you don't know, and that everyone is in a different position of knowing. So at all times, everyone is at a different level. Everyone is an expert within their own sense of knowing. And we can't really know what others know and all that kind of thing. So in this overall idea of like experience as expert, or, people who have the time to bear down on this work or stay with this work, I think it just undercuts and removes like audience agency, and this idea that of course everyone can respond to something intuitively, instinctually, again from their own kind of knowledge base. Everyone has a position from which they can kind of stand from.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of some of my thoughts there.
Thank you. Anybody else? Anybody sympathetic to the way that he views art? You could try it sometime.
I mean, I like the idea of like a more like the Kantian approach. Like I'm like, okay, that makes sense. I can see that. But yeah, it's like, I don't know. I guess with like both Danto and Greenberg, there's like this like forced universality. It's like, okay, I have this theory and now I have to apply it to like every aspect of life ever. And like, it has to fit into this theory. And so then it just becomes these like outrageous claims that are just like ridiculous. So it's like, sure, maybe sometimes, but not all the time, or, I don't know.
Well, the reason I think he's not being fair to Greenberg is that I suspect Greenberg was actually intelligent. And if Greenberg was intelligent, he would know what Kant meant was that the consensus is a presumed consensus. It's not an expected one. When I see that this rose is beautiful, I presume that if everyone could see it from my vantage point at that moment in this light, they would agree. But it's just presumed. It's not insisted upon, like, God damn it, this is beautiful art. And if you only had the experienced eye, you would get it. But the larger point of this essay on Greenberg is that he wants to argue that whenever you pin criticism on form, you're in deep doo-doo. I didn't put that very well. Form as the marker of art is problematic, is deeply problematic because you can't presume that everybody's going to react in the same way to form. It's really about content. Content's where it's at. That's the main point for him. And this is where the quote of Matisse comes important again, right? We are, all of us, caught up in history. And when pieces speak to us, they speak to us as passengers. They are agents of history, and we're passengers of it, and they speak to us, they resonate with us, right? There's a beautiful quote in the chapter on the museum, which was saying, this guy was criticizing the museum, saying, they no longer capture what is traumatic in American society, but if they did, then that would be the artist as agent of history speaking to us, passengers of history, right? Then we get it. Let me see. A couple other points on this chapter. He said there was kind of that tragic story about the show on oceanic and African art at the MoMA, page 94. I don't know if you guys saw that, thought about that. So weird, right? I do have a question about it for you all, but I'm going to just review it first. The middle of page 94, in 1984, the show Primitivism and Modern Art was based on affinities between oceanic and African works. He says a few lines down, they imply that the African or the oceanic artist was driven by the same kind of formal considerations as modernists. And many critics felt this to reek of what we might call cultural colonialism. And I was just curious if you guys had any thoughts on that event, because my first thought is, oh boy, 1984, weren't they naive and stupid? But I guess my question for you all is, does this still go on? I kind of suspected you might say yes. So can anybody give any examples of what he's complaining about here?
Recently, the Met redesigned their, it was like, again, a very ambiguous, large section of the museum that grouped like Arabic work, but there was also like historic Chinese work. It was just like very problematic in this overscope of like Asia and in their reconstruction, they like recreated like Egyptian pharaoh hall. They made these entrances with these like Egyptian kind of entrance ways. They basically like increased the fetishized nature of these cultures and kind of perpetuated stereotypes or tropes to kind of like organize. They were kind of proclaiming like, we're going to break up this massive section that we've grouped in, and we're going to kind of like specialize in these different like individual cultures, but in order to kind of still like sell it, or there was still kind of this like fetishized idea of like the foreign or the exotic or the unknown in the way that all of the stuff was displayed. So there was quite a lot of controversy around that, because it was like, well, you don't have that type of entranceway going into like the modern art section, right? So yeah. Like, what is this kind of like caricature or again, like tropes that are perpetuated. So, and that was very recent. That was only, I think, 2 years ago or something.
Was there pushback?
Oh, major pushback. And so then they had to go back and they kind of redesigned some of the wall labels. Yeah. So I'm not totally sure what the outcome was in terms of how many changes they made after the pushback, but in many ways it was like kind of considered a failure. Whereas like MoMA just revealed its whole like reorganization of its collection. And so far people have been more open to it. I think there's still some cracks in it, but it's, they really are trying to like break apart a linear trajectory of modernism.
So. Jeez, man, curation is hard work.
Tell me about it.
All these fights, huh? It's so different.
Yeah, that's why I'm like, when Danto says like, we're all liberated, I'm like, no.
Interesting. Well, thank you for the example you relate. That I would have to point out, though, I think that sounds a little different, though, from what he's talking about. And maybe this is why maybe this is worth mentioning for just this precise reason. It's almost like the error that he's describing is the opposite of the error you're describing. So you're talking about at the Met, they were, I don't know what they were. What did you fetishize?
I see what you're saying. Like back then, it was the like kind of melting pot.
They were trying to say, look what.
Look how we're all alike. Look how we're all like following similar forms.
Yeah, look at what Picasso
Right.
had in common with the African art forms.
Right.
Major appropriation.
Which is now, I mean, I think that's happening now with like the current kind of fetishization and excitement for like museums to feature Black artists. It's like Black artists are getting grouped into these like giant universal themes.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh yeah, all Black artists like experience the same thing, and they're all coming from the same sense of history, and they all like, that's happening a lot. So maybe that's a better example. And that's certainly becoming highly problematic in these like bigger museums, or like women, the Baltimore Museum of Art, like it's big like women in art, and kind of just like creating these big bubbles. Yeah, I don't know, maybe that's a better example of some current melting pot, I think, is like what the multiculturalism of the 90s was all about. Like we're better if we're all coming from one accepted place. I don't know.
Great, thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in? Yeah, what the issue that he describes, and I believe that was the MoMA, right? Yeah, is a purported claim that there were similarities in form, concerns over form, that united these artists across different cultures. And the criticism of that at the time, and this is the criticism I understand Danto advancing, which is that you can't understand the decisions on form without understanding the context, the cultural context in which they come, which also means that the form and the content are deeply entwined. You can't just say, oh, what Picasso did kind of looks like African art, and therefore they must have similar formal considerations. I remember back, you all have to help me now. I'm going back 30 years to my undergraduate art history class, but I remember something vaguely that Picasso was inspired by African art. Is that true? Like masks?
He went to Africa and took masks.
Oh, even
and
better.
Brought them back, and then directly like copied.
Bingo.
Took the famous like one of his famous pieces of the women,
I don't know how to pronounce it, but
the like famous woman piece with all the faces, all those masks are direct, like you side by side. It's a literal copy of
Les Demoiselles d'Avignon.
Yeah. So, and he like, he had all these masks in his house that he like went and took and got from different tribes. And obviously not, didn't reference that at all in any of his, credits.
Yeah, just
Right. So it's almost like the guys who are doing this exhibit at the moment were trying to save Picasso, right? We know you're a colonialist pig, but we're going to at least say that you had similar formal interests and considerations. But then the continued complaint is that in their original context, in the African masks, these were coming from a totally different basis or origin, which means that there's always going to be some kind of fatal disconnect between the two. I don't know, though, Babette, I'm thinking about the examples you gave, and I wonder how you all have to say about this, about artists being grouped. You were talking about African American artists being grouped with other artists because they're seen to be expressing certain universal themes. And it would be better if they were grouped with other African American artists. Is that the suggestion? How do we do this breakdown? Do you know what I mean? Maybe I did make my question clear enough. Let me try it again. You made it, Babette, if I didn't get your example right, please tell me. But it sounds to me like the contemporary analogy you're seeing is that, artists, and this is an outgrowth of identity politics, right? That certain artists, they say, this is what makes curators' jobs hard, which is like, hey, why'd you put my art with that grouping? Because that doesn't really uniquely capture what I'm trying to say. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's identity politics, but that has always kind of been in play, I would argue.
Yeah.
I think the grouping happening now is the showcase of diversity, being diverse and diversity. And so
In the same gallery or in different galleries, each with their own gallery?
like, museums now are like, we are diverse because we are spending the whole year having, like the BMA, whole year of, female artists. And that's our representation of our diversity and our expanding of our kind of collection. So it even is going further away from even identity politics in a way, and going into kind of large solution-based things. That it doesn't then mean that these individual female artists who also are a mix of race and age and location, context, form, medium.
They're only related because
They're just related because they're women. I think group shows in general are highly I mean, to do a group show is, I don't, that's a whole nother conversation around what is a group show's purpose. I think it's a very egotistical stance from curators to I think the group show becomes about the curator, not about the artists. But that's a personal opinion that I can go down. But I think, right, it's these groupings to solve a problem institutionally or systemically versus these groupings to unpack form or unpack content or unpack historical significance. None of that is there. It is, we need to solve this problem on an institutional scale, on a national scale, on a funding scale. So then that's like the bottom line impetus for these groupings.
I also think that when we talk about groupings, there's also a huge disparity between what is considered craft and what is considered artwork, especially different regions and different professions. I do know in the World Fair, when it was started, there was art from France, but then different regions then are just kind of slopped into other locations, even if it is considered as art. And we also have to think about other nations and how they kind of perceive art, because obviously if you're in China, they're going to have more Chinese art than America. But then even then there's this whole issue of where did it come from and who made it, but then also what is it labeled as? And there's just a lot of issues with that, just because it's all kind of mixed into the politics of what curation is like. I do remember me going to the Met, and I just, every single piece of Chinese artwork I saw is donated by John or Will, and I'm like, why?
Wait, what's your point about Chinese art? That it was donated by who?
It's usually donated by some Western person who
Oh.
probably just like stolen it. And at that point, it's just like, it's the pieces that are like that. I'm just like, ah, yes, this is being presented as art. And then I go into like
Yeah.
the other pottery areas and like, why is this craft?
Yeah. By the way, when they're indicated like that by who donated them, that's for tax purposes.
Yeah, I assumed, but it's just like, why specifically you, Mr. John Smith?
That's a question for Bad Bet. Why do they even have to? Can't they just like, you can look it up on your own? Why do you have to put it on the dang thing? I mean,
Well, the thing about that is like,
A relation.
when they like say that, I'm like, you obviously just like plundered that when the opium war was going on, and I'm very upset about that.
and if not, someone else did and they just bought it, right?
Right? There's this whole there's like this whole this is a little off topic, but there's this whole trade where the Chinese government is like buying back all of the rare like artifacts and like artwork from the West because like, hey, we would really like that back, please.
Interesting.
It reminds me of something because I collect no like me and my friend or something like just we did an interview for the old like the collectors in China,
Mhm.
like the traditional one, and uh that collector works in the caution, but he thinks that it looks like he thinks that the art itself is doesn't that matter. What it matters is the author, like the creator who creates this art. So this art could sell like in a high price and the caution. So it's weird. And also we did like some compared questions of the art blockchain. And then he thinks that the art blockchain is like nonsense, is kind of um, break the like traditional market of traditional art market, something like this.
Sorry, what was nonsense? I didn't catch that last comment.
Like the art blockchain, like you can put your art or on the blockchain and then people could buy it online.
I see, I see.
Yeah, and prove it this art is real or you're not screenshotted, and then because there are some like decoding art or something like this on the chain, and then to prove that the artist belongs to you, they have a signature of the art. So on the chain, it could like prove that it belongs on you. So it belongs to you. So the traditional collector think this kind of sell model break the traditional art market, and it looks like nonsense because you cannot like prove this art is true or not, and you can screenshot it and then use it, something like
I see.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I also just wanted to say that I agree with like Babette on that. Like there's definitely this like overcompensating that happens in order to like make up for like mistakes in the past done with these like group shows that like do more harm than good. Like I feel like the example that Danto gave of the primitive and modern art show, like there's always going to be like sensitivities that people have to things like that. Like looking back now, of course we're like, okay, how are you going to have
a show with like modern art that like is inherently stealing from the primitive art shown like next to it, you know, like it's just like wrong, like you're not giving rights to the primitive art. And then these days it's like if you have a group show that's all women artists or all Black artists, it's like the only thing usually that these works have in common is that it's all the work is done by Black people or all the work is done by women. And I don't know, I just think that there needs to be like some kind of like balance in between, and I don't know where to find that, because it becomes like embarrassing for the people having these shows. Like you really like you couldn't find any similarities besides the fact that it's Black people. Like it makes me think of how I've had like critiques in the past where I've just had like professors be like, oh, does this have to do with like your background and like your whatever? And I'm like, no, it has nothing to do with that at all. And I've actually had like a teacher like apologize to me after, like, I'm so sorry for assuming that this piece was about you being Black, you know. So it's like just stuff like that yeah, I don't know.
I'm so glad you made that comment, Kat, because that was kind of the thought in my head earlier, and I didn't want to be the one to say it. I'm glad you said it. You know, I mean, the reason I feel for Babette today's a great big pity party for Babette being a curator. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't, right?
One of my current thoughts, though.
I have a proposal, by the way, but let's hear from Babette.
Okay, yeah. One of my proposals is actually to return to the manifesto, to return to ages of like movement and manifestos, because it is small groupings, condensed, like very clear intentions, clear organization, clear reasons for gathering and being, and also like fleeting. And there's a freedom of like knowing that the manifesto is constructed around a specific moment in time or a specific mission or a specific goal. And so I don't know, I find this idea of like manifestos, even obviously in Danto's writing, where it's like pretty like, you know, there's a little bit of like, we've all talked about it. It was like so ego and it's like so righteous and it lasts for only a second and all that stuff. At the same time, in modernism, it did allow so many different groupings of artists to have equal kind of prominence and legitimacy and direction and organization that again like was formed around a central idea of like tenets or beliefs versus like again like, you know, these larger like vague voids of like identity or location of country or, you know, and I think leaning into that and being like, and what didn't work in the past with manifestos that does now is like, we have an understanding of how short-lived these manifestos are. So there's also an embrace of like the ephemeral. And like in this moment within this year, maybe this particular grouping of artists is kind of declaring a certain stance with the understanding that like we now know history changes really fast.
Good.
I don't know.
I love it. Anybody want to respond? Anybody in the mood for manifestos? All right, I'm going to defend your manifesto. It's a much better idea than I had. My idea was, let's just ask the artists where they want to put their stuff in. I don't know how practical that is. Maybe it's, but what do I know? Like
Completely underlooked is just like, talk to the artist, please. Like very simple.
Was if I suddenly, from my outside position, came in with an idea that solved all curation's problems, I think Jose Ruiz would kill me. But you know, because there's just no way. But I like your idea, and I like what you say, and I think it's really important. We're laughing at the manifestos, and yet there is something really valuable there. So you all know that I'm an, you know, even though I've been at Mike 15 years, I'm an outsider to the art world. And since I've been at MICA, you know, I have watched as the undergraduates are forced to double and triple over down on their attempts to write these artist statements. And I've had to edit many in my day. And I've often thought about that project in the liberal arts side here, you know, there's been big debates in our department about what we should do in helping students write these statements. The critics complain that it's an exercise in narcissism. We have to get you artists to get in touch with your, what am I really feeling? What am I really channeling? What am I really, you know, what is surging through me, right? I was thinking of Kat's encounter with her professor, like, are you secretly channeling racist or racial themes? Like, it's just happening, like get into touch with that. And we've, you know, I'm very critical of that. I'm not, anything that sniffs of narcissism, I'm not crazy about it. And I've often thought the artist statement is kind of strange because I agree with Matisse in a way. Good art and good artists, they don't always know what they're doing. I don't believe it. But what we're discovering here, I think what we're agreeing on, as far as I can tell, is that the exercise of trying to do this is crucially important, at least for the curators, right? Why is the artist statement important? Let's get as much specifics out as possible about your intention, right? Because it's maybe impractical for me to go around and poll the artists individually and put them where they want. And you could also argue there are virtues for groupings itself. That's something I'd like to hear about, you know. The curator still plays some kind of crucial middle role here, right? The artist is not the principal presenter of his or her work. I mean, not really. I don't know that. I mean, there's some, I guess he or she could, but it's not, the curator has to think about presenting that art to the public and it having an impact and an effect, and what is the best way to do it. And sometimes that is to be done by way of groupings. You're always going to have necessary conflict between curation and artist, always. It's inevitable. But if the artist could at least be fucking specific, that might help, or explicit. And I want to hear from the artists. Being explicit, the practice of being explicit, does that help you? Any artists want to speak to that? Being explicit, does it help, or do you feel like it's futile?
I mean, I feel like it's helpful to an extent, and then it's unhelpful in another way. Like, you know, it's nice to be able to like step back and clarify your work or clarify the certain progress you've been making. And obviously be able to like somewhat explain it to other people. But at the same time, if you are like, this is my art statement, then like all your work has to be funneled through that, which also is very limiting. And then also it's just like, it's that like weird translation of like, how can you translate something visual into something that's verbal and like expect that it's gonna like carry through, or at least that's how I feel like it's hard to, you know, it's hard to put into words what it is, because it's not, the form isn't words, it's something else. So, you know, it's helpful and then not helpful at the same time.
Thank you for clearing that up. No,
That's just my opinion. Other people
yeah,
may feel
no, I'm joking. I kind of totally suspected that would be the response, you know.
For me, probably our statement is like, just make it up. Like, just write it for that time. Because when I look at my pieces in a different time, I have different feelings sometimes. So, and when I do it, probably in the first time in the beginning, I think I want to do this thing, but in the end, it's like totally different, or it contains different things. So I don't know. Just
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any other way I mean, I have bad news for artists. It's funny, when I got to art school, I was told the artists, they came to art school because they didn't want to do too many academics, and many of them were like, I don't want to write. I have bad news for you. It sounds like you're going to have to write a lot and all the time, because as you point out, Jennifer, the way your work may change, right?
Yeah, because the most of the art statement, like the my art statement is more like I look at my thing and choose one like more fitable statement for my pieces. Is that clear?
Say it again. I'm sorry, Jennifer, I didn't quite catch that.
Like I write statement, when I write statement, it's more like I choose one like more fitable statement or point for my artwork, not what I wanna do, like, or this art piece contain. Yeah.
I think it's a good idea to limit your scope in any given artist statement. I think so.
I also think that like any piece of writing, it is also prone to miscommunication because tone and like intentions are very hard to get across in writing. And also you have to take into consideration that everybody else is also complex and thinks in their own way, and they might not see it in the way that you might see it. And no matter how explicit you will get, it's always gonna have some alteration when being read by a second person. So I don't know. I feel like if this could be solved, it would have been solved, and this is something unfortunate.
Well, I don't have a problem. I mean, my opinion is I don't have a problem with problems that can't be solved. That's my motto. You know, you're gonna, as I was saying a minute ago, you're going to have invariable conflicts between curators and artists. But I noticed the comment here. Was that from you, Babette? Artists are trained to change or shift their artistic statements, or is that Rosemary?
Yeah, I was gonna say artists and curators, because we also have to like write statements of purpose, and it's like you're literally trained to say, adjust your writing to appease the particular group you're applying for or the thing you're applying for. So it's like it further removes it from anything that has any real source of truth, because you're supposed to kind of shift and adjust everything to kind of, again, appease the people.
It's almost pro forma. You know, what pro forma means is like it's a formality. I'm starting to sniff legalese here. There's a legal issue, right? I'm tempted to ask Babette this question. I bet if that you're for your professional artist, first of all, and you want to place your art in a museum, you need an artist statement or a copious amount of them as part of the legal documents, just to have your piece in that museum. Because what does legal documents do? Legal documents try to resolve potential conflicts ahead of time that are inevitable, right? What we're talking about here, this is an inevitable landscape of conflict. This is never going to be ironed out, right? And I think you're totally right, Jay. I mean, how could, and this follows on what Jennifer's saying too, is like, realistically speaking, listen, there's no way we can expect artists whose profession it is to express themselves through artistic media. We can't expect that they will express themselves fully, completely, and accurately in words. You know what I mean? It's hard enough for writers to do that. Therefore, these are formal documents that have to be gotten out of the way so that Babette can say, where the fuck do you want me to put your piece? Okay. Sign on the dotted line. Have your lawyer call me if you're pissed. We'll deal, you know. But that's why I was getting at this point, like, all right, what do artist statements do? Are they just a legal document to make Babette's life easier? Or do they do something for you as a creator? Even if they're varying.
As like from like the artist perspective, I don't find them useful to like my own practice. It's like, yeah, more of a hindrance and like really annoying. But as like, you know, it is helpful sometimes to, as a viewer, to go into a space and like see a work and like, you know, gather my own experience from it, but then read an artist statement or a little bit more context about the work. And you're like, oh, you know, that maybe this is something I hadn't considered, or it, you know, confirms something I was thinking, or it just gives you a little bit more context. So, but maybe that's more of the curator's job than the artist's job, is to write a little statement. But so, you know, as a viewer, it's sometimes nice, but as an artist, I find it more of a hassle and like something I dread doing.
Yeah.
I feel like for me, it's only useful like the more that I work on it and like change it as I go along. Like if I use it like as a practice to be like, okay, I'm gonna work on this like every 5 months, and like as my work is shifting, like I'll play around with these words, and then it helps me like, I don't know, make a little path for myself and like stay in the direction that I want to be, and not just turn into like this like vague, just be in this like vague realm of like working and doing stuff that doesn't really have any like conceptual meaning anymore. So I feel like it's good for me to like stay focused. But I think the more dedicated you are to like one statement that like is not changing very often, then it becomes like a hindrance and you're like restraining yourself for sure. So
I think so.
it depends.
I'm thinking of the artist statement in the context you just related, Rosemary, when you're standing in a museum and you see a piece of art and you're trying to interpret it, and you can read on the wall, well, what the hell was this guy doing? And you read about it. It occurs to me that neither of the major philosophical traditions we're dealing with right here, the Kantian tradition, the Hegelian tradition, neither of them put much stock in the individual artist to be able to express his or her intentions accurately, which is kind of ironic and funny. I'll just recap. For Kant, it's about genius. You were visited by an angel, in a matter of speaking, and you expressed something and is incommunicable about your method of how you were able to do this. That's his conception of artistic genius. And says similarly incommunicable how the audience appreciates beauty. For Hegel, it's the quote by Matisse: "You are a channel, in some extent, through which a voice of history speaks through you." That's slightly more self-conscious. You could at least say, like, I was motivated to do this piece by this event and by these feelings. But in both cases, the agency or the autonomy of the artist is still diminished, which again just makes the whole process of an artist statement strange in a way. You know, do you become a better artist by becoming more self-conscious of your motivations? I'm not convinced of that. Of course, I'm not an artist. But I haven't heard you guys give a ringing endorsement for that. Again, the idea, do you become a better artist the more self-conscious you are of what's going on? I don't know.
I mean, I think in these critics saying like, oh, don't worry, artists, you don't have to say what you're about. We do. It's justifying the purpose and the role and providing like opportunity to have a job in, you know, they're like kind of justifying their reason for existence. It's like, oh yeah, the artists, like, you know, they need us, the audience needs us, everyone needs us to be able to be the like translator, in a way. So that's just.
So unfortunately, we keep arriving at the instrumental value of these artist statements, that you need these if you're going to be a professional artist. So you all need to go and confront your studio faculty and say, is this the best you can say? Is this the best you can do? Give me more here, because I don't know. I'm trying to think if there's any philosophers we're going to read in this class who will help us see the value of the artist statement in a different way. Unfortunately, we're going backwards next week because we're going to be talking about Freud, and Freud was the king of unconscious motivations, right? Good luck trying to make yourself transparent. Good luck. Tain't gonna happen, right? In any case, I want to move on in the interest of time. These are some really good points, though. I really like this conversation. Undergraduates, you still have to write your artist statements. Don't fuck around, and don't blame me and say, well, my philosophy professor said I don't have to write this shit. Don't you do that. I will find you. All right, let's move on. The next chapter, I really like the way he describes the value of pop art. Where he says he describes it as transfiguring or transfigurative. And he describes it as almost, but here, this is middle of page 130, is a beautiful quote. And this is really what opened my eyes. Like, I never really thought much of Warhol, like I thought of Warhol as dormitory art, right? You had the Marilyn Monroe in your room and they sold them in the student lounge, whatever. And then I was like, wow, this is different here. I could appreciate this. Middle of 130, he says, I think pop art too transfigures into art what everybody knows, the objects and icons of common cultural experience, the common furnishings of the group mind at the current moment of history. Abstract expressionism, by contrast, was concerned with hidden processes and was predicated on surrealist premises. Its practitioners sought to be shamans in touch with primordial forces. It was metaphysical through and through, whereas pop celebrated the most ordinary things of the most ordinary lives. Cornflakes, canned soup, soap pads, movie stars, comics, and by the processes of transfiguration gave them an almost transcendental air. Gave them a transcendental air. It's like it elevated them, For the poor housewife in 1950s locked at home with Brillo pads, suddenly the Brillo pad, instead of being just a symbol of repression and cleaning, you're scrubbing your dishes, is now an object of art as well, right? He elevated. He injected an air of transcendence into the everyday. One thing is clear. This is where Andy gets cryptic because he never says as much. All we do know is that Andy Warhol was obsessed with pop culture. Like earnestly. Not even like ironically, as far as I can tell. Like, he actually really enjoyed cornflakes, and he really, really liked Campbell's soup. He was a funny guy. He goes on a few lines down. What philosophy was to do henceforward after the end is difficult to say, but presumably something useful and of direct human service. Pop art meant the end of art, as I've argued, and what artists were to do after the end of art is also difficult to say, but it was at least a possibility that art too might be enlisted in the direct service to humanity. So here's where, if abstract expressionism was obscure and esoteric, pop art is not. It's highly democratic because everybody can appreciate Marilyn Monroe in that lithograph, right? And then one more beautiful quote on the next page, top 131. He says, pop set itself against art as a whole in favor of real life. Right? There's no more metaphysical dualism like the abstract expressionists saw. A few lines down, he says on 131, what they answered to, that is the pop artists, was some universal sense that people wanted to enjoy their lives now as they were, and not on some different plane or in some different world or in some later stage of history for which the present was a preparation. They did not want to defer the sacrifice, which is why the Black movement and the women's movement in America were so urgent, and why in Soviet Union one had to stop celebrating the heroes of a distant utopia. Nobody wanted to wait to go to heaven for their reward or to take joy in members of the class of society living in a future socialist utopia. Just being left alone to live in the world pop creates a consciousness was a good life as anyone wanted. Whatever social programs there were to be had to be consistent with that. We don't need another hero, says Barbara Kruger. So what's funny here is, wow, this makes pop art sound like liberation theology. Like, yeah, Andy Warhol never would have uttered such a thing. Never. He would never admit it. But this is his point carried over from that quote from Matisse, like an artist unwittingly, Andy Warhol unwittingly is channeling something like the liberation movements that we're seeing across the globe in the 60s. This was analogous to the liberation movement in Russia, or where else did he see it? In the civil rights movement in America, the women's rights movement in America as well. Soon the gay rights movement. Like, what he was doing in art was analogous to those civil rights movements, that what they were doing politically. What do you guys think of that? Sound okay to you?
I think at least it became useful for something. So I'm not really a fan of it, but yeah, I'm glad that it ended up becoming like something that people could use to make like politically charged like statements, and like yeah, feel good with that. So that's nice.
Yeah, one problem with the age of manifestos that you see in abstract expressionism is that art is only understood by an elect, right? There's only a chosen few, Mondrian and a couple people. Now it's suddenly, fuck it. I think Liechtenstein is an example of a pop artist, correct? So a comic strip, that can be art. Is he suggesting that Barbara Kruger is a pop artist? She's the one who did those posters, right? Yeah. So it's hugely accessible, but it's not only is it hugely accessible, but there's something important political in there, right? If I recall, Barbara Kruger's pieces are very explicitly political. Not so Andy Warhol. And I have no recollection of Liechtenstein, whether he is. I don't think he is, as far as I remember. So the funny thing about pop art is, generally speaking, with a few exceptions, it's not explicitly political. It's implicitly political. It's proposing a revolution kind of like in stealth form. Any other important pop artists that I'm neglecting? What's Cy Twombly? What is he?
I got a little
no,
confused
sorry.
about Joseph Bias because, you know, he mentions him a lot as kind of one of these people who's also kind of in the part of like end of art world. But I would never assume Joseph Bias is a pop artist.
Oh, you know, I don't know his stuff at all. I thought he was an abstract expressionist. No?
No, it's like really
It's like perform.
it's like
more conceptual. I think.
conceptual performance. I mean, he was in his own lane. Like he did so much like writing. I don't know. He was like in his whole crazy world on his own.
He's the guy Danto quotes who says art can be anything now.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
My understanding is that he was an example of contemporary art. I don't, but you think he's saying he is pop art specifically?
Only because he brought him up a couple times inside that chapter.
Yeah.
But only dropping in like quotes of what he said. But he never directly says he is a pop artist. But
Well, here's what's funny, right? Pop art is important to him because this is the big rupture. And so boys is useful to explain what has happened, what is new with contemporary art. By the way, Jay, your cat is very cute. And I'm jealous. But he can't say it's hard. We're being unfaithful. Starting to talk about pop as a school. Because the whole point of contemporary art is there's no more schools, right? So I'm being bad talking about who are the pop artists. It's not cool of me to do that. But
and I guess confusion around like him using Barbara's quote around like we don't need any heroes, but then like Andy Warhol being the hero of pop art. It feels a little contradictory there.
but that's why I keep making the point Warhol would be the first to reject it.
Right.
Well, that's also the problem is like Warhol like wasn't the one being like, this is what it's about. It's
No.
not being like, I had this profound experience and now I know what Andy Warhol was thinking. And he is this like brilliant genius and hero. And like, so it's just all like coming from Danto's perspective, whether or not Warhol felt that way.
But again, the point is like for Danto being Hegelian, and as an artist, you are a passenger or you're a channel of history, right? So Warhol, it's not, he can't really pat himself on the back. He's giving birth to something through him, fundamental. Any case, I just wanted to call your attention to what he has to say about those quotes on pop art, because I just really like that characterization. And I just think, it's a very impressive way to see and understand pop art. But again, it's just problematized by the fact that Warhol never, endorses that.
I also sometimes think like, okay, so we are able to like celebrate the ordinary thing. We're able to celebrate the, you said like the housewives who are using scrubbing dishes, like now their dishes scrubbing is being celebrated. But part of me is like, did they even care? Like, it feels like it's celebrating people who weren't celebrating the everyday are now like, oh, the everyday is worth examining. I don't know. I'm like imagining these housewives, like, were they aware of like pop art happening in New York City, Upper East Side galleries? I'm just wondering, like, does the housewife even care that all of a sudden like some weird artist is like excited about?
I go back to what I was saying last week. I think Warhol was just fucking with the people in Manhattan. That's what I was thinking he's in, because he knows those Manhattanites don't know what Brillo pads are. He knows that. He's like, come on, people, see this high art. And then he's like laughing his ass off in the corner. But the funny thing is, who's very happy for his art soon? Coca-Cola, Campbell's, Hollywood. They fucking love it. He does a service for those brands. And here's where Warhol gets complex. I don't think he cares. He's not like, Warhol was not a moral purist. He's like, oh no, I've been branded. No, he didn't. No, he loved these brands. And he was interested in conflating art with these brands. That's exactly the point. Instead of seeing a gap between them, he built this bridge, between them.
And he wanted to be, some of the more clearer writings from him or interviews is like, he wanted to be famous, period.
Did.
Like he was obsessed with fame.
Yeah.
So that was his real ultimate.
As like an experiment, like he wasn't going to do with fame what other people do, It was almost like, this is part of my job too. This is part of my artistic project. Let me see what fame is like, and I'll play around with that.
There was an interesting article once written that like he was potentially the first like reality star
Yeah.
and being famous for just being famous. Like it wasn't like an actress. It wasn't like you did anything. You were just became famous. And then fame was a job.
Yeah. We'll talk about him some more next week, but I have just been fascinated with him in the last few years because after I started teaching Danto. If you've ever been to Pittsburgh, his museum is there. It's worth visiting. Anybody seen it? No, it's good. I took my kids. They actually liked it. My kids are all sciencey, so I was surprised. I was also surprised to hear that, this is something just to think on, Warhol was extremely religious. Even though he was gay, he was an observant Catholic, and he went to church every week and sat in the back row, this church on the Upper East Side, even while during the week he was filming gay orgies. He was very complex dude, to say the least. Lived with his mama, right? Lived with his mother. He would sleep till 4, come down, put on his wig, go to work. All right, let's do something. Oh, Jay, why'd you put newspapers?
Oh, I was commenting on, I think that said something like, "Do they even know what these housewives even know?" I was like, making newspapers.
Yeah. Well, it was not going to take long before Warhol's work got well known. I mean, why is his stuff the most expensive art pieces right now? It's because it was so widely transmitted. We have about 5 minutes, so why don't we talk a little bit about that museum essay, that chapter. Let's revisit that now. He suggests that museums, he's dealing with this claim that museums might be out of their time. They might be done. And that pop art might have killed them. The title of that chapter on the museum is really telling, right? The thirsting museums and the thirsting millions, right? You guys, that's what you were getting at the beginning there, like as if the working class in Brooklyn was like thirsting. All these Irish workers thirsting for what? Whistler and Turner and all the stuff that the waspy upper crust thought that they should be thirsting for, or they're thirsting for, they didn't realize they were thirsting for it, right? This is what you should be thirsting for. Let's build this museum. Who knows what they were thirsting for? And pop art has really put these museums, I mean, contemporary art, he says, put these museums in crisis. Well, I can't help but notice museums are around. They're doing quite well. So they've survived. How have they survived this crisis? Or maybe they haven't exactly.
I think museums now, like, less than the only place to view art, it's become almost a location for installations for larger pieces that can't be shown in like other locations, like in public. You have like pop-up designs, which is more of like a location of graphic designers, and you have murals, which is also just like um, these large scale illustrations. But then you have things like experiential art or performing art, and these kinds of things you can't really do in public without weird stares or like impeding on normal daily life. So museums have almost become this sort of theater for art where you can experience pieces of art, or places where you can like view pieces of art that like you may not be able to see or be able to handle or be able to like appreciate in the outside environment. Like we could take Da Vinci's pieces, for example. Like he experimented so much with like things like watercolor and glazes, and if you take them outside, they would deteriorate so fast. Like they're so hard to preserve.
Yeah.
What's wrong?
The way you're talking and your cat sounds like Danto. That strikes me as Danto's conclusion.
Mhm.
you know, the aspirations of the museum class who built these museums, they had high aspirations that were quasi-religious, that were, you know, hard to meet. And yet his conclusion at the end, despite everything about pop art, is that he says, you know, in his very last paragraph, he says, like, we still need these places as venues where maybe, if rare, these encounters with meaning can still happen. That's why that's the way I read him.
Right.
One thing I'm sorry, Jay. Did you want to say something else?
Oh, I was also going to make like this very pompous statement, which is
Love
that
it. Bring it.
we are in a philosophy class. It's
I
fine. um, okay, whiny. Which is that like museums are a 3D history book that you can walk through. And I think that's okay.
Well, it is okay. And I think he doesn't say this, but they are at least a testament to the history of art and artists' intentions and aspirations. Because I saw something in this chapter. I've taught this book for years, and it's never occurred to me. Like, there is a historical parallel in the development of museums. There's a historical parallel to the ages of art. The modern era, you know, I mean, before art, there were no museums. Sounds dumb, right? But there were none. You would go to a church. In the age of imitation, there was one museum because there was one standard of beauty. The age of manifestos, suddenly you have different, he talks about, I think, tribalism. You have different museums. You have the Jewish Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, right? The Pompidou, that can channel these different manifestos. And then suddenly, no museum, right? Contemporary art is the age of no museum. It's completely blown up. But you still have to have repositories for these different types of art. They just can't, it's just getting hard. Boy, Babette, your job is hard. It's going to be hard putting all these types of art together, right? Which means the BMA should get rid of its contemporary art wing, God damn it.
Yeah.
Who's with me?
Yeah. I was gonna say there's also when, you know, this is like a topic that I feel like I know way too much about, so I'm not gonna over talk about it. But the other parallel running to like the parallel of art movements and the parallel of museum movement is also the parallel of government systems and the shift from smaller government to big government and the shift towards neoliberalism. And the museum has always been situated as a government. It is a government system. It's part of our institutions. So it has been responsible for the gaps that exist in the separation between politics and life and religion. And that it's kind of, so that's another interesting parallel to just be thinking about, is like the shift in big government, small government, especially nationally here in the US, shifts the museum's purpose dramatically.
I feel like that's opening another can of worms that I really want to get into, but I'm out of time here because I have to get ready for my talk. Okay, everybody. So I'm going to leave you there on that pregnant pause. Okay, we can start there next week when we talk about Freud. Okay. So you all are set, right? For today, there were reading responses for Danto. For next week, you'll read Freud. If you have any issues accessing that text, let me know. And the reading responses. Then next week, we'll also talk about your midterm paper topics, which you're doing a bit. Okay. All right. Have a great week. See you, everybody. Bye. Good talk.
Thank you.
Bye.